Hey there, fly fishing friends. Lance Egan here with Fly Fish Food with this week's Skill Builder number 9. Today, our topic is still water. We're going to do rods, we're going to cover lines, and a few leader setups. Check it out. But before we get started, don't forget to mash that subscribe button so you don't miss any of these skill builders.
That's a big round, bro!
All right, rods for still water. Still water is one of my favorite ways to fish, especially in the spring when all the rivers are up high and not my favorite time of year to fish the moving water. So with that in mind, let's look at some of these rods. What are we looking for in a still water rod? Number one, we want a pretty powerful action, medium fast to fast action type of rod. That's one of the first attributes I would look at when I'm thinking about getting a still water specific rod. We need it to be capable of handling a wide variety of densities of lines. We're going to throw floating lines, and we're going to throw type 7 or type 8 sinking lines and everything between. So we need a very versatile rod. We need a rod that's powerful enough to handle the rig. So for me, most of the time I use a 6-weight rod for most of my still water fishing. That said, if you're chasing smaller fish, maybe in the high country, maybe a 4 or even a 5-weight would be a better option. If you're chasing really large stillwater fish or dealing with wind or throwing really big flies, maybe even lean towards a 7, possibly an 8. An 8's a little heavier than I like to get for most trout fishing, but 6 for me is that happy medium. So with that in mind, keep in mind also you got to tailor this to where you're going to fish. So if I was a high alpine angler, I would probably fish a 10-foot 4-weight, maybe a 10-foot 5-weight often. For most of our larger reservoirs out here in the west, I tend towards a 10-foot 6-weight. Next up, with that in mind, length. Where do we need to be with length? So 9 foot is where I would consider the short end of the spectrum on stillwater rods, getting up towards 10 plus on the long end of things. So as you look at these rods, I think you'll find they vary a bit in the length options when you start out looking at price points. So when you're at a lower price point, there are less long rods available. When you get into the mid price points, a few more. When you get into the premium rods, then they kind of have everything from 9, 9.5, 10, and so on. Length is an important feature in a stillwater rod. Number one, what does it do? Well, in a single-handed rod, I like 9 to 10 foot most of the time. I fished a 10-footer. Why do I need a longer rod for stillwater? You don't have to have it. A 9-footer will work. But a 10-footer gives you a couple things. Number one, on a lake, you're often trying to cast quite far, recovering water. With that in mind, when we make a back cast and a forward cast, we want to keep that long cast up off the water. So whether we're sitting low in a float tube, on a bank, or even sitting on a boat or standing on a boat, it's an advantage to have more length, keeping your line, especially with a dense sinking line, up off the water to allow you and enable you to throw a nice long cast. Another fringe benefit of a longer rod, if you're familiar with the technique called the hang. The hang is when you've retrieved your flies almost all the way in, let's say on a sinking line or a midge tip, intermediate, something like that, and they've been kind of trending horizontally, and then all of a sudden they get to you and they transition to that change of direction to where they're coming up towards your rod tip. We do what's called the hang. You get to a point in your line where instead of stripping anymore, you start lifting the rod, and when you lift that rod, the longer the rod is, the further away from you you can do the hang. So a longer rod is an advantage, a 9.5, 10 foot over a 9-footer, let's say, because it will allow you to fish the hang a little further away from your position or your boat. So length is an important feature, important attribute on a Euro rod. What else? Again, we need them to be pretty powerful. We are going to make some long casts in still water. One thing that's often overlooked is casting ability. In a river, sometimes it's not that big of a deal because most of your casts are pretty short. We get relatively short drifts in moving water. In a lake, casting further is a much bigger advantage because we're going to cover a lot more water that way. So practice your casting and then find a rod that happens to fit your casting style and allows you to make long casts and cover more water. All right, let's talk about some price points. I'm not going to talk specific prices here because they change every year, and this video is going to be on the internet for a while. So we just kind of categorize them in basic price points, less expensive options. And this is not all inclusive of our assortment, but these are some standouts for us and also some that we had in stock right now. So on the low end of things, the Redington Vice, Temple Fork Legacy, Echo Lago is another good one that are on the less expensive end of the spectrum. In more of the mid price points, the Echo Stillwater, the Orvis Recon, the Loomis IMX Pro, the Sage Sonic, all very capable rods. In more of the premium rods, the new Orvis Helios comes in a 10-foot 6 weight. The Scott Centric and the Sage R8 are 3 of our top-selling premium models. And then one other thing to think about when you're talking still water that's caught on in the last few years, mostly thanks to Pyramid Lake, is switch rods. This is the Reddington Dually. The Echo SR is another one we sell quite frequently. And the switch rods are not very common for sinking lines. They're popular for floating lines and an indicator rig because they allow you to deal with wind and cast that fly and those rigs out a little further away than the single-handed rods can, especially in a heavy wind. Hopefully that gave you some ideas about what to look for in a still water rod. Check them out. We've got them online and in the shop. Still water lines. Look at all these bad boys. Tons of lines here. This can get a little bit confusing. Let's try and make it less confusing and break these down one step at a time. Let's start with floating lines. We'll start up high on the surface and we'll work our way to depth as we go with the sinking lines. So these are all floating line options. There are lots and lots of floating line options that are not represented here. This is just a smattering, honestly, of just random lines that I grabbed with a few favorites in there. So things to think about when you're looking at a still water specific floating line. It doesn't need to be still water specific. You can fish any floating line in still water. But the rigs and things we're going to use, the types of flies, sizes of flies, wind resistance of the flies, and so on that we tend to use in still water are usually a bit different than what we see in river situations. So with that in mind, some of the favorites for me, I really like the Scientific Angler's Infinity taper. It's just an all-around taper. It has a fairly long head design. It doesn't turn over prematurely. It will delay turnover and carry quite a ways out, so it allows for longer casts. It will mend and reposition well because it's got a longer head on it. It's not such an abrupt front taper that it doesn't turn over with too much power. That said, it is a half line heavy, so it does have a fairly powerful delivery. The Airflow Universal Taper or the Airflow Power Taper are a couple of great options as well, with some decent head lengths and very high performing lines that are low stretch versus the SA is a little higher stretch. The Rio Gold you can get in their Elite or their Premier. This one's the Premier series, as you can see. This has a little more stretch. The Elite is more of a low stretch line. Again, I chose the Gold because it's a little heavier line than standard rating, and it has a good head length for still water applications. If we get into more mid-price point lines, the Cortland Peach or some of the Scientific Angler Mastery series lines would be good options. In more budget-friendly stuff, the Rio Mainstream, the Scientific Angler's Frequency, the Trout or the Boost, the Mainstream Trout, even the Aircell from Scientific Anglers would be serviceable. Not the best of lines, but on a real tight budget, that would be a very serviceable line. The things we need them to do, we need them to float well. We need them to be able to turn over. These floating lines are going to have to turn over leeches, buggers, large dry flies, dry in a dropper, and in many cases a strike indicator with a team of flies, sometimes 2 or 3 flies on there. So we need a pretty powerful type of line. Any fly line, all that said, any regular weight forward design type of floating fly line can work for still water use. The one outlier here is this guy I have on the end, the Anadro indicator, which there are other lines from these other companies, from Rio and Cortland, that are very similar as far as what they're designed to do. It's kind of a line that's got a really heavy head. It's a very long taper. It's got a very powerful delivery. So like the Rio Extreme indicator would be another good option for this. These lines are best if you're mostly an indicator, still water angler. So hanging balanced leeches, balanced minnows, chronomids, things like that. This line will turn over very well in the wind. It has a powerful delivery and a powerful head that will cast that rig very, very well. So if you're an indicator junkie, that might be the best option. It's not as versatile as fishing the rest of these lines because it's pretty aggressive. I don't like it with dries. I don't like it for really subtle, soft presentations in the shallows. Then I would lean more towards any of these other options here. But if you're really focused on an indicator still water rig, that would be a line I would suggest. For me, I end up using the Infinity for most of my other still water floating line needs, or something in more of a trout type taper for dry fly fishing. let's look at what we commonly call midge tip lines. So midge tips, some of the brands call them midge tip. Rio says that here. Scientific English calls theirs their clear emerger tip. On the airflow packages, when you talk to most anglers that fish them, they call them midge tips. On their packages, they call them mini tips on the airflows. All basically the same thing. So number one, let's define what a midge tip is. A midge tip is basically a floating line with a very short sink tip section. Very short is relative to, you could buy midge tips that range from 18 inches on the really, really shallow end of things. More commonly, they're 3, 4, 6, 5 feet in length, and on the long end of things, like some of these airflows, you can get a 12-footer. So what does a midge tip do? A midge tip, different than a floating line because of that short intermediate section that, again, is most commonly, let's say 3 to 6 feet is the most common lengths of midge tips. When you have that type of an intermediate tip, that part of the line kind of sets into the water. I'll demonstrate that here for you in a second with a little piece of line here, but it sticks into the water and creates a little more contact. It also can keep your flies deeper a little bit. It's not really aiding them in sinking much because these are all relatively slow sinking tips. But that's all a midge tip is just a very short, slow sinking tip. So one question we get asked a lot is, I already have a sink tip for rivers. Can I use that as my midge tip? Well, you could try it, but most sink tips for rivers are designed to be very quick. So instead of the line being, pretty high floating and then very fast sinking on the end, these are very shallow, very slow sinking. So they'll fish at a different angle and they would fish very shallow. A couple of things that I think is really important to note about midge tips is that they're incredibly versatile. Much like the floating line, we can do lots of things with these. So we could fish flies, 15, 20 feet deep with a long leader and a heavy fly. We could also fish flies just below the surface with most of these midge tips. And we do that just by having the weight of our flies change. If we wanted to fish very deep, we would fish a very long leader with 2, 3 flies. You could fish a single fly if you want, but 2 or 3 flies is more common. And have your heaviest fly on the point and allow it to get very, very deep by casting as far as you can, counting the fly down and allowing it to fish almost vertical. On the flip side of that, we could fish any of these midge tips with a floating fly like a booby or a fab on the point and have unweighted flies between our intermediate tip and that floating fly. The floating fly would be up in the surface, creating a bit of buoyancy, and we'd have a little bit of the line sinking down below it to where when we pull on that line, it pulls down on our buoyant fly, and the other nymphs or whatever we have attached to it will follow suit. And then when we pause, that floating fly wants to lift the rig up, and the sinking portion wants to pull the rig down, but it doesn't fish very deep because we have that floating buoyant fly on the point. So we could fish all weighted flies on a midge tip. We could fish all unweighted flies. We could fish a mix of unweighted and buoyant flies, or we could even fish a pair or a single buoyant floating fly to stay super shallow, all with a midge tip. So very, very versatile type of line. Now that said, personally, I end up using them the very most for fishing, I would call it mid depths, but fishing very slow. I use midge tips usually from a boat, but occasionally from the bank as well, where I want to fish leeches, chronomids, damsels, calabatus, that kind of stuff, but I want to fish them from the surface down to maybe 14 or 15 feet. Past that is capable, but it takes a pretty heavy fly, and I think a lot of times there's more efficient ways of getting to that depth. So for me, I'm using them a lot in 6, 8, 10, 12 feet of water and trying to fish relatively near the bottom, usually with like a balanced leech, with a chronomid. Maybe like my most common rig would be a balanced leech on the point, a chronomid in the middle, and maybe an unweighted fly on the surface, or a heavy chronomid on the point, a medium weight chronomid in the middle, and an unweighted chronomid on the surface, a calabatus on the surface, some sort of scud in the middle, and maybe some sort of a leech or something like that on the point. Or if I want to fish really shallow, I would fish a fab or a booby on the point, and a couple of unweighted nymphs like chronomids, like calabatus, like damsels, between the sinking portion of the tip and that buoyant fly. So very, very versatile. Okay, Why do we want different lengths of sink tips? Well, that varies quite a bit. And honestly, if you're just getting into stillwater fishing, I don't think you need a whole bunch of these. I think you need to pick one that's somewhere in the middle, like the emerger tip that's a 5-foot tip, maybe one of the standard 3 to 6 foot midge tips from Rio or from Airflow. To me, a 3 to 6 is most common, and I would get it in just the standard or the faster tips. I wouldn't get one of the really slow like the hover if you just have one midge tip. Now for competitors often are in a boat with people where the person that's fishing on the other end of the boat is just kicking your butt, and they have this long and you have the standard, and that kind of a difference in the line setup can equal quite a few more fish. And in that case, as a competitor, you feel like you kind of need to have a whole bunch more of these bases covered. But for most of us that are just out there for a fun day on the water, you can make any of these do pretty well if you're somewhere in the middle. You're not the super long 12-footers, you're not a super short 18-incher. As far as the sinking tip, you're somewhere in that 3, 5, 6 foot range. So they make these, many of the companies make these in different densities as well. So for instance, this Rio midge tip here, forget about the line weights here, just think about the sinking. We've got a F&I, which stands for floating and intermediate. So intermediate tip. This particular one, I believe, is a 3-foot versus the 6-foot on the long. And then the long hover over here is the same length tip as this guy, but this is a 1.5 inches per second versus 1 inch per second sinking tip. So not a big difference there, a very small difference. If I were suggesting one of these two, I would get the standard, the 1.5 inch sink rate. If you look at the Airflows, we have a 3-foot tip in the anchor tip, which is a very fast sink. We have a 3-foot fast tip that's a little slower. Then in the 6-footers, we have a slow and a fast tip. And in the 12-footers, we have a slow, a mid tip, or a fast tip. So lots of options there. Personally, I end up fishing the Scientific Anglers 5, the Rio 6-footers, or the Airflow 3 or 6-footers the very, very most. For me personally, lately I've been fishing this Rio midge tip. I've been trying them out, been liking that one quite a bit. Previous to that, I've been fishing this Stillwater sonar clear tip from Scientific Anglers, or the Airflow. Usually I do the fast tips in the Airflow, the 6 or the 3-foot fast tips. All very, very versatile, all very fun to fish. Again, think balance leeches, think chronomids, think calabatus, think scuds, think damsels, little nymphs, even just stripping in hare's ears, soft hackle type patterns. These are not a trolling line. They are, if you're a troller, you don't really need this line. It's not going to do you any good. These are designed to be stationary, so either from an anchored boat or in a boat where you can slow the drift down, like fishing with a drogue, or in a kick boat where you're using fins to slow down your drift. Any of those applications, and also fishing from the bank, these can be very, very deadly. This is one of those lines that I think every angler should have in your kit. If you're a lake angler and you have only a floating line, next up you need an intermediate, you need a midge tip, you need a 3, a 5, and a 7. That would get your bases covered. If you wanted to go one step further, then I'd get a parabolic, which we'll talk about here in just a second. So let's move on to the next density, which is an intermediate line. So intermediate lines are often misunderstood. They are a full sinking line. The entire line sinks. They just sink very slowly. So most of these lines are going to be 1 to maybe 1.5 or 2 inches per second. Most commonly, they're 1.5 inches per second sink rates. So they call them an intermediate because they're designed to be a bit more intermediate density. They sink, but they sink so slow that they're not plummeting through the water column like a 3 or a 5 or a 7 or something like that would. So an intermediate, for me, this line is very versatile. I can also fish it lots of depths, but the reason for me to fish it most of the time is when I want to fish shallow, number one, or number two, I want to fish very slow. Now, one advantage that an intermediate or any of the sinking lines have over, say, a floating line or a midge tip is that they're going to sink. So they're going to cut through the very first top layer of water, that surface layer of water that's moving fast, that might be influenced in a lake situation by wind, most commonly, that can create some current. So where a floating line, if you had a crosswind, a floating line would be cast out and that crosswind would belly it out and pull your flies across from your position and kind of swing them through a drift, where in still water it's very important to often stay in contact with your rig. An intermediate or a heavier sinking line will often make that same cast, and the wind, because it cuts through the water surface, the wind doesn't influence it nearly as much because it's not laying on the surface of the water. So an intermediate, although it doesn't fish very deep very well, it does fish subsurface quite well, and you can fish it relatively deep, again with weighted flies. For me, I tend to use the intermediate lines more to fish shallow, let's say 10 feet of water and less. And it's also very, very important to have this line when you want to fish when the water's very cold. So one question we get a lot is, all the sinking lines, I should say, sink to the bottom eventually, so can't I just buy a Type 3 sink and make that work for everything? And the answer is that's probably the most versatile sinking line, but it doesn't cover every base, because let's say you want to fish at ice out when the water is 37, 34, 36 degree water, and the fish are not very active. They want your fly patterns just crawled. You can't fish a Type 3 line very slow in the shallows because it gets right to the bottom. You could fish a midge tip or a floating line or an intermediate, a very slow sinking line, and pull those flies very slow, keep them in the strike zone in the water column, the shallow part of the water column that you want to target, and keep it there a long time without having to move your flies too fast. Where a faster sinking line, sure, we could just cast it and strip it as soon as it hits the water, but it's sinking all the time, versus these intermediates are also sinking all the time, but they're sinking at 1.5 inches per second, so they're not moving very quickly. Okay, so now that we've kind of established that, let's talk some real basics here. All these companies offer intermediate lines. Airflow here, we have their mid-intermediate or their fast intermediate, so 1 inch per second, 1.5 inches per second. They're available in different line weights. I just grabbed random lines here, but these are available. Most of these have, let's say 5 weight through 7 or 8s. In some cases, they start at 6 weight through 7 or 8s. From Scientific Anglers, we have their Clear Camo, which is a very popular line for us. It's kind of a clearish line, sinks very slow, or we have their Hover that sinks even slower. I believe more like 1.5 inches per second versus 1 inch per second. So very, very slow sinking lines. We have the Rio Camelux. This is more of a 1.5 inches per second to up to 2 inches per second line. So a little on the faster end of an intermediate, but also a very good line. Kind of a drab coloration, not clear because it has a different core. Same with the Airflows, they're not clear lines, but they are slow sinking lines. On more of a budget-friendly option, the Scientific Anglers Frequency. This is also a true intermediate. It is a clear line. It is more budget-friendly because it's not as expensive as the rest of these. It will give you a bit more memory because of that, but it is a very fishable line. And I just realized we left one of these out, the classic, the Cortland Clear Camo, the original, what I would call the original camo style clear type line. We should have grabbed one of those, but shout out to Cortland. They do have still one of the more popular intermediate clear type of lines. So again, fishing these relatively shallow, oftentimes slow, but doesn't have to be slow. Think leeches, think buggers, think crayfish, think minnow imitations, as well as any of the nymphs. You could swim chronomids, damsels, calabatus, scuds. All that kind of stuff is all fair game with the intermediates. They're just a slow sinking line that helps you fish without getting too much depth too quickly. All right, getting deeper in the sinking lines here, literally and figuratively, we are working with now mostly Type 3s, but we do have a Type 2 in the mix as well. So think 2 to 3 inches per second, generally speaking. So fishing a bit deeper than our last option, the intermediate. So these are just a little quicker sink. They're going to fish to mid depths, let's say 5-6 feet to maybe 10-12 really easily. The Type 3 or Type 2 line will sink all the way to the bottom of the lake eventually. It just takes a long time to get there. So again, one of the comments, do I really need a Type 6 or a Type 7 or a Type 5 when I already have a Sink 3? Well, it depends. You want to spend half or 2/3 of your day waiting for your line to get to the depth you want to sink, or do you want to get your flies there as quick as possible and then be more efficient? So in the case of these Type 2 and 3 lines, for me, these are more the workhorse, middle of the water column. I probably use a type 3 line very most in my sinking line range. Some of that has to do with the times of year that I tend to fish lakes, but again, this is in kind of the middle. This is not, it doesn't float. It's not a slow intermediate. It's kind of in the middle of sink rates. So, if a 7 or 8 is your fastest sink, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in there, 2's on the slow end of things, a 3 or 4 more in the middle end of things. So, the middle of things. So, the type 3, the Sonar Stillwater, this is one where we should talk a little bit also about density compensation. So a lot of these higher end lines, like these on top here, have some density compensation built in, where, like Scientific English calls it, their seamless density option, where the line is the densest, the tip of the line is the densest part of the fly line, and it gets less dense as you run back. I'll show you a bit about what that does to your fly line here in a second, but basically think about the way that the line sinks. Instead of the whole line sinking and sinking flat, because the way that the taper designs are, the thing that sinks a fly line is tungsten powder that's mixed into the PVC or PE type of coating. And so if you have more tungsten powder in the head of the line, then it tends to sink fastest where there's the most tungsten powder, and sink the slowest where there's the least amount of tungsten powder. So the back end and the tip of the lines tend to sink slower than the middle portions of the lines where that head of the weight forward design is. So on a seamless density line, like some of these density compensated options, they make the tips as dense as any part of the line with extra tungsten powder, and then they slowly become less dense towards the back end. So in Scientific English case, they even do a type 1 sink on the back, transitioning to a type 3 sink on the head. Again, that just makes that line pull much straighter, more horizontal. It improves your contact with the flies. Your strike detection is increased in that case, and it keeps your flies in a very reliable strike zone. That's not unique of this line. That's true of these lines as well. Now, one thing you lose when you go to a more of a value price line, which many companies offer here, you lose that density compensation. So although these are full sinking lines, they don't sink uniform. They're not density compensated. So the tips and the back end of the running line portions of the fly line will sink slower than the middle of the line. So with that in mind, a type 3, again, let's think of depths between 3 or 4 feet all the way up to maybe 15 feet. I think a type 3 really comfortably fishes about 6, 8, maybe 10 or 12 feet deep. You can get them to sink to the bottom eventually. Just the less dense your line is, the more that it sinks. As soon as you start pulling it and you move the flies, it starts planing up. The more dense the line is, the more it sinks faster, and when you start moving it, it tends to stay down more rather than moving towards you as soon as you start retrieving the flies. So again, a very versatile line. For me, probably the most commonly used sinking line in my Stillwater kit. All right, getting deeper still, we have type 5 and type 6 sink lines. Most common is a 5. A few of the companies offer a 5 and a 6. Again, density compensation is important in these to keep your flies pulling nice and straight. Less of an option on the less expensive lines, but saving your wallet a few bucks by getting the non-density compensated options. So starting with this Sonar Stillwater here on the top left, this is what Scientific English again calls their seamless density line. This is a type 3 sink on the back end and a type 5 sink on the head, the fishing end of the line. So again, that's designed to keep you in contact with the fly, make more of a straighter pull. The Sixth Sense, this is what they call a DI5 from Airflow, a density compensated line. Density integrated, I believe, is what DI stands for. This is a very good line as well, and is density compensated, will pull nice and straight. The Airflow Fathoms, they come in, the Rio Fathoms come in either type 5 or type 6. So only a slight change, 5 inches per second versus 6 inches per second there. To me, you don't need both of these. You need to just pick one or the other. Personally, I do my sinking lines in intermediate, 3, 5, and 7. So I skip the 6 sinks and just do, skip the 2s, skip the 4s, skip the 6s, do kind of the odd numbers. That way I don't have to have every line under the sun. You can, again, get these in more of a budget-friendly option. Frequency or wet cell from Scientific Anglers are much less expensive than these more premium lines, but you are giving up some lack of memory in these, so these don't coil as much. These are not density compensated on the bottom here versus the top here is compensated, so they're going to pull a bit straighter. Where would we fish these? When we want to rip flies, we want to move flies pretty fast but keep them down. Very dense lines like a 5 or a 6 would be very good for that situation. Or if we just want to get deep, you want to count a fly down to 15 or 20 feet, 10, 12 feet even, but you want to get there pretty quick. This is going to do the job. Will the Type 3 get you there? It will. It'll just take longer. So if you're catching fish, you're out on the lake and you've got a Type 3 on and you're catching all your fish towards the middle or end of your retrieve when your flies are at their deepest point, the little light bulb should go off in your head and go, you know what I should do? I should take the 2.5, 3 minutes that it takes me to change fly lines and put on a 5 or a 7 or something that sinks faster and see if I can increase my catch rate by getting my flies deeper and keeping them in that zone longer. That's when you'd go from an intermediate or a Type 3 to a Type 5, Type 6 type application. Otherwise, just getting big flies or pulling flies relatively quickly that you want the line to stay down. Again, keep in mind with the denser lines, they all sink to the bottom eventually, but if you start retrieving, they start planing up in the water column. The denser they are, the Type 5s, Type 6s, Type 7s, they don't plane up quite as much. The other techniques I like, so fly-wise, think minnow imitations, leeches, buggers, most of that type of stuff. The other thing that we use dense lines for quite frequently are very buoyant flies, like fishing a couple of boobies and casting out a fast sinking line that goes out as far as you can cast it, sinks to depth really quickly, and then you fish floating flies that come up off the bottom, and your sinking line can even be pinned to the bottom, but fishing flies close to the bottom very, very slowly. That's another technique we use with these faster sinking lines. Again, available in different price points from different companies. If you have a favorite brand, run with what you like. Go with the girl that brought you to the dance, right? But check out these Stillwater lines and make a decision whether you want to go odds or evens. I like to go odds. I do the 3, 5s, and 7s, but there are options available for you. Again, faster sinking Type 5, Type 6. All right, moving along, we now have the densest of the lines, the Type 6, 7, whatever, even 8s. In this case, we've got the Scientific Anglers 5, 7. They do a dual density, Type 5 in the back, Type 7 on the tip. The Rio Fathom in a Type 7. The Airflow 6 cents in a DI7 or DI8. So this is the fastest sinking line on the market at the moment that I'm aware of. Somebody else probably makes one that's just as fast that I don't know of, but that is the one that I know of. The rest of these are Type 7, so think 7 inches per second or 8 inches per second, pretty straightforward. These are designed to get you down dirty, get you deep, keep you there, get it deep fast, etc. Best when you're fishing depths, best when you want to move flies really quick at depth, or you want to just fish slow but really deep. Both are good options for these deep sinking lines. These are also popular lines if you're a troller. If you like to troll flies, these lines tend to be dense enough that they will continue sinking a little bit even if you're pulling them at a pretty good clip. So they're popular with the trolling crowd. As far as application of these, for me, again, we're talking mostly leeches, minnows, think crayfish, think buggers, minnow imitations, things that you're going to swim quite aggressively. They do sink fast, all of these lines, so if you're going to fish something really slow, it better be fished pretty deep or over deep water where you're not going to grab the bottom, because these lines are designed to get you down and they're going to get into the zone quickly. So for me, I'm fishing these either on very steep banks. A lot of our reservoirs out here in the West are flooded canyons where we often fish tight to a bank from a boat and cast to a bank, and we want those lines to kind of go down a steeper bank and follow that shoreline contour. That's where I would use one of these, or in later summer when the water temperatures near the surface are a bit on the warmer side and it forces the fish to depth. Maybe they're down there 20 feet, 25 feet. You could take one of these lines, cast them as far as you can, give it time, count the line down. If it sinks at 6 or 7 or 8 inches per second, you can figure out the math there. Count it down to the depth that you need your flies to get. Don't move it until the fly and your line reaches that depth, and then start retrieving. And if you do that, you can fish nice and deep. You can keep flies pretty deep, and you can move them pretty quick as well without the risk of them pulling up in the water column too much. They're still going to do it a little. They always do it eventually because they're pulling up to wherever you are, but they're not going to fish as shallow as much of those slower sinking lines. These lines are not some, and really even the last batch, the 5s and 6s, are lines that I don't use much from shore because they sink so fast that they end up getting snagged on the bottom quite a bit as you pull your flies up from, off of a shelf or off of a point or whatever. They sink so quickly that you end up losing a lot of gear to the rocks or the sticks, as the case may be. So for me, these are limited more to a boat or a float tube, but a very efficient tool when you want to get your rig deep and you want to keep it there and you want to get it there fast so you're not wasting all of your day waiting for your flies and fly line to sink to the appropriate depth. We've covered all the sink rates. There's one more to throw in here, one more wrench to throw in your Stillwater collection works. This is a line that for me I would probably buy last of all of my sinking lines. However, it is a very, very efficient line at doing certain things. These lines are what we call sweep lines or parabolic lines. So Airflow and Rio are calling them sweeps, Scientific Anglers parabolic. The idea is the same. The idea is this: they have different densities built into the line at different points in the line. So if we're using this Scientific Anglers diagram here, this particular line is a type 3, a type 5, and a type 3 again. So in this case, we're really trying to accentuate that curve. The way that line bellies through the water, the tip is very slow sinking, the back end of the line is very slow sinking, and the belly is very fast sinking. So it tends to sweep through the water column. That's why these companies call them sweep lines. There are times where fish are stratified. They're throughout the water column. There are times where you don't know where the fish are. There are times where you just want to cover water and try and find fish. To me, these are best as a searching line. I use my sweep type lines as that. I start most of the time with they make these in different, like Airflow, you can buy a type 3, a type 5, or a type 7 sweep. Scientific Anglers currently just offers this parabolic. They call it the 353. So think more like a 5 sweep. In Rio, we've got the 2-4-I or the 4-6-I. So they're kind of in the slower end or faster end of sweeps. For me, I use these most commonly as a searching line, and I do that because you can tell a lot by when you get strikes or when you hook a fish on a parabolic or a sweep style line. If you cast this out a decent ways and you're getting all of your strikes early on in the retrieve, as soon as the flies hit the water, you're getting your strikes maybe in the first 10 strips, the fish are pretty high in the water column. They're not very far down. If it's more in the middle of the retrieve, then it's probably at its deepest point, and then you are getting those fish nice and deep, then you probably want to change to a faster sinking line. If you're getting it on the transition going up, well, there's a little more murky there. You don't really know, but it's probably somewhere in the middle of the water column. So with that in mind, when I put one of these on, I use it most of the time as a searching line because I want to try and figure out where those fish are. Now, if you have a fish finder or you have some other intel that tells you exactly where the fish are, you might be able to eliminate this step. But that said, if I'm fishing one of these lines and I'm getting all my strikes in the first 5-10 strips, I'm going to take this line off and go to maybe an intermediate or a type 3 line, something that's not going to get as deep in the column. If I'm getting all those eats towards the middle or end of my retrieve, I'm probably going to put on a 5 or maybe even a type 7 line to get my flies deeper and keep them there, and then adjust from there. If that starts changing up what I've got going, that's not good. The other thing you can do with these lines is you can use them to fish contours. So you could fish tight to a bank where when your rig lands, you want it to stay pretty shallow, but then you want it as it drops off to fall down the deeper part of that's going to follow that sink profile of this line. So you could fish it on a steeper bank. Or the other time that I use this line a lot is when I'm worried about contact with flies. By fishing, let's say a buoyant fly, like most commonly for me a fab or a smaller booby that has some buoyancy but not tons, a fab for me most of the time on the point. Then a couple of either lightly weighted or standard buggers or leeches above it. I can then fish a fly line like this that is sweeping through the water column. I've got a fly that's buoyant, that's staying very shallow, but has some has some buoyancy to it. I have a fly line that's a bit more dense down below that's pulling my rig down at depth, and I usually have some lightly weighted like small tungsten buggers or leeches or something that are forcing the top end of the leader down. What happens then is I have a fly that's buoyant, that's pulling one direction. I have a line and tungsten flies that are pulling another direction, and it keeps the line very tight. That's not limited to these. You could do this with any sinking line, but then with that type of rig, we have really good strike detection, and we tend to get very positive hook sets because we take a lot of the slack out of the cast. Because every time I strip, instead of stripping in and then having a bunch of slack in the line, every time I strip, I've got the density of the line and the flies pulling one direction and the buoyancy of that fab or booby pulling the other direction. So we keep a very tight line. Again, to me, mostly a searching line. They can be used to fish contours. You can fish them for that contact rig. That can work really well when fish are being nippy. They don't want to commit to things. You can get really good strike detection there. The last line that I would add to my collection personally, others may disagree with me there, but this is I would first get a floating, a midge tip, an intermediate, a 3, a 5, and a 7, and then to complete the kit, I'd get one of these parabolics. They come in all different weights, or from different brands. One thing you don't see here, and it's because nobody offers it so far, is more of a value, a budget-minded parabolic or sweep style line. They're basically limited more to the higher end price points, but I think you'll find that they're pretty niche type items, so most companies don't sell enough of them to probably warrant making them in lower price point options. Check them out though, sweeps, parabolics, available across the board. Just to kind of paint the picture, we've talked a lot about all these lines. I want to just finish up the line segment here by kind of just showing you on this makeshift diagram, if you will, what these lines are going to do. All of you are probably familiar with the floating line. If we make the black part of this mat is the water, and the board up here is the surface. A floating line is obviously going to float right at the surface, like so. We know what it's going to do. If we're hanging an indicator rig, then our rig's going to be down below that, fishing usually pretty vertical. If we move from a floating line to a midge tip, then we have a floating portion of the line for most of it, and then a bit of the tip of the line sinks at a bit of an angle like that. That allows us to fish deep or relatively shallow, depending on what our flies make the rig do. So we can fish this rig pretty vertical. We can also fish it pretty horizontal and fairly shallow. Think midge tips in those kinds of angles, floating line here. Then if we move to an intermediate, the whole intermediate line sinks. It's going to fish just below. Again, this board is the surface of the water. So an intermediate's going to sink to the bottom eventually, actually, but it sinks so slow that as soon as we make a cast, it kind of breaks. If it's flat calm, some intermediates actually even need a little bit of help to break the surface tension, and then they'll break the surface tension and start sinking very slowly. But as soon as we start retrieving them, they kind of hold that depth, so they'll fish very, very shallow. Then if we move to like a type 2, type 3 type line, we're going to get a bit deeper. Same thing, it breaks the surface tension, sinks to a particular depth, and then retrieves in kind of that zone. So if we move it faster, it will plane up. If we move it nice and slow, it'll kind of stay at that depth for most of the retrieve until you get it in at the very end, and then it has to change direction and come up to your position at the boat. A type 4, 5, 6, 7, again, getting deeper still. So if we're doing a 5 or a 6 sink, it's going to get 3s in here. 5 or 6 is at this depth, whatever this may be. Again, you're counting these down to depth, but it's fishing deeper. A type 7 or type 8, deeper still. Then painting the picture of the parabolic, which is maybe the hardest to do here with my fingers, but we're basically doing a line that looks something like this. It's kind of sweeping through the column, so it's going to follow this trajectory. It's going to fish, your leader will fish shallow first, then as it goes through that retrieve, it's going to fish down here deeper, and then it will follow back up on the back end towards you and your boat or your float tube. So the parabolic kind of sweeps through the water column. It's not limited to one particular depth. The rest of those density compensated lines are designed to have the tip be the densest part of the line, so it's pulling quite horizontal. The midge tip and the floating line are usually fished much more vertical, and the parabolic or sweep lines are fishing in more of kind of a U shape. They're going to sweep through the water column in kind of that elongated U shape. So hopefully that kind of paints the picture of what each of those lines is doing when you're fishing them on your favorite lake. All right, next up, let's talk about leaders and maybe a little bit about tippet when you're fishing still water. So one of the most common things to do when you're fishing in general is just grab a 9-foot 5X. We see that quite often. Yeah, that can work for you, but in most still water applications, that's not the best leader for you. Regardless of the line you're using, whether it's a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, whatever, you usually don't want that 9-foot 5X, so let's get rid of that. Let's talk more about heavier stuff. So maybe 4X on the light end of leaders for me is where I would start buying leaders. And most of my own fishing, I end up buying either 2 or 3X leaders for still water, or I build my own kind of custom style leaders for some of the applications specifically of sinking lines. But let's talk first about floating lines and some applications there. So if I'm fishing dry flies or a dry and a dropper or an indicator, then I will often use a tapered leader of some sort. With dry flies, I tend to buy short leaders, 2X, 3X, 7.5 footers, and then let's pretend that this piece here is the end of one of those leaders. I will then triple surgeons some material on there. So this is the end of this piece here. I will triple surgeon some fluorocarbon or some nylon. For me, always fluorocarbon tippet in, again, what matching or getting thinner. So if I bought a 2X leader, I would usually do 2X, like when I fish one of our local still waters a lot with dry flies in the summertime. I start with a leader like this. I tie my top dry fly, usually a big foam chubby Chernobyl or something like that, a big hopper, to this tag. Then I triple surgeons knotted down here, and I do another triple surgeons knot to leave a second tag. So I've got tag 1 here, tag 2 in the middle. This will get a second dry fly. And then on the terminal end, I will put my other dry if I'm fishing 3 flies. We can legally do that in Utah. If I was fishing 2 dries and a dropper, I'd fish a dry there, a dry in the middle, and a sinking nymph or a chronomid or something like that on the tag. Keep in mind, these are not to scale. I don't put them 8 to 10 inches apart like I would in rivers. In this case, I'd fish them at minimum 3 feet apart and more commonly 4 or 5 feet apart on each of these flies. If you're fishing a dropper down here, then that could vary, could be even deeper than that depending on how deep you want to get. But most of the time I would fish a dropper, let's say 3 to maybe 6 feet in depth below the dry. If I'm fishing 3 dries, they're all spaced out 4 or 5 feet generally. But on tags on the top 2 and then terminal end for the final dry fly. If we're fishing an indicator rig, then if I'm fishing with 2 flies, I would only have 1 dropper tag, so I'd have my top fly on that dropper and I would have my point fly down here on the terminal end of this piece here. So maybe a balance leech on the point and a chronomid up above it, or a chronomid and a scud, or a damsel and a chronomid, or any combination of those depending on what you're finding in your water. I would also fish this same rig on a midge tip. So if I was fishing 3 flies, top fly, middle fly, terminal fly, again 4 or 5 feet apart. If I'm fishing sinking lines, same thing, top fly, middle fly, terminal fly. However, with midge tips and sinking lines, I don't want the thick leader butt, so I tend to build my own. So in that case, we sell these Stillwater streamer leaders. I just build my own. I needle nail or nail knot, in this case, the butt section to the fly line. Then I take just a bit of 20-pound on all of my sinking lines, my midge tips. I use pure fluorocarbon. So fluorocarbon from here, I've just got 20-pound fluoro in about 18 or 20 inches, let's say. I blood knot a bit of 15, again for another 15, 18, 20 inches. Terminate at a tippet ring here. Hopefully you can see that. And then I just change my tippet out on the tippet ring. So I build kind of semi-permanent butt sections, basically what this is doing. This is a 20 and 15-pound fluoro that terminates in a tippet ring. It doesn't have a loop, so you can just nail knot it or needle nail knot right to your fly line. And we basically leave these, I like to leave these semi-permanent butt sections on all of those. Being fluoro and being 15 and 20 pound, they're usually quite a bit heavier, quite a bit stronger than the 2X, 3X, maybe 4X tippet that I would add to this tippet ring. So I can use this for a year, sometimes even a couple of years before it degrades enough that I have to feel like I need to replace it. That way I don't have to tie this knot or these rigs very often. All I'm changing each time out is from the tippet ring down. That's a very easy way, again, on all my sinking lines and my midge tip line. If you're fishing an indicator rig, we do sell these absolute indicator Stillwater leaders from Scientific Anglers, which have a kind of a hot orange butt section, but they're a much shorter, more compact butt section with a longer tippet. The idea there is you want more of the thin material to allow your flies to sink very quickly and get to depth, and also reduce memory so you stay in contact with them. You can certainly indicator fish with a standard taper leader, but I would suggest either buying one of these or building your own. Get some Maxima Chameleon in, let's say, 20 or even 25 pound. Build a butt section, create a little tie a tipper ring on the end of that. Have your indicator right on the end of that Maxima, and then from the tippet ring down, run straight 3X, 4X, whatever you find might be advantageous for the clarity of water, size of fly, size of fish you're going to encounter. For me, with indicator rigs, I most commonly fish 4X, occasionally 3 if the fish are really large, or if they're super spooky, super picky, maybe I'd go down to 5, but I don't commonly get that light in lakes. So there again, can you use a standard taper leader? You certainly can, but we don't often need it except when we're throwing dry fly rigs. If we're fishing streamers, or we're fishing a midge tip with nymphs, or fishing an indicator system, then we might want to go away from the standard taper leaders and go to something that's more tailored toward the Stillwater situation. Last but not least, let's talk real quickly just about tippet. For me, I think you've probably heard in some of these other videos, I just carry fluorocarbon tippet only. That's all I use, so I don't have nylon. That said, you can certainly use nylon. Fluorocarbon in the case of Stillwater fishing, where we're almost always fishing below the surface. The exception is with the dry fly rig, but even then I use a nylon leader with fluorocarbon tippet to the flies. But with all the other techniques, buggers, leeches, minnows, crayfish, scuds, chironomids, doesn't matter. We're fishing those below the surface, and the advantages of fluorocarbon are well established. So I would suggest just using your favorite brand of fluorocarbon tippet to attach to the nylon leaders, or if you're fishing a sinking line or a midge tip or something that's going to be fished all subsurface, I would suggest starting with a total fluorocarbon butt section. Whether you buy one of these or you build your own, doesn't matter, but start with something like that, add fluorocarbon tippet to it, and you're off and running and fishing.